My name is Sarah Martinez, and 7 years ago, my ex-husband Derek stood in our kitchen screaming that I was broke and stupid, that I'd never amount to anything without him. Last Tuesday, I watched his face drain of color as his own lawyer, Robert Sterling, looked up from my business card and said, "Your Honor, opposing counsel is Sarah Martinez from Sterling and Associates. She graduated summa cum laude from UC Berkeley Law and specializes in complex family litigation." The silence in that courtroom was deafening. Derek's mouth hung open like he'd seen a ghost, and honestly, maybe he had. The ghost of the woman he tried to destroy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in Riverside County Family Court. I walked through those heavy wooden doors carrying my leather briefcase, the one I'd saved for months to buy, wearing the navy suit that had become my armor. My heels clicked against the marble floor with a confidence I'd earned the hard way. As I approached the defendant's table, I could see Derek whispering frantically to his attorney, that same condescending smirk I remembered from our marriage plastered across his face. He looked exactly the same perfectly styled hair, same expensive watch, same way of sitting like he owned every room he entered. But something was different about me, and I could tell he felt it. Gone was the uncertain girl who used to apologize for taking up space in her own home. In her place stood a woman who had learned to command attention, who spoke with the authority of someone who had fought for every single thing she'd achieved. When Robert Sterling, Derek's high-powered attorney, first glanced at me, I could see him making the same assumptions Derek had made for years. Just another small-town lawyer, probably overwhelmed by his reputation and client list. But then he looked down at the business card I'd handed him, and I watched his expression shift from dismissive to surprised, to something approaching respect. Sterling and Associates wasn't just any law firm. It was the firm that handled the most complex, high-stakes family law cases in Southern California. And I wasn't just any lawyer working there. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. 7 years earlier, I had been a completely different person, living a completely different life. I was Sarah Thompson then, married to Derek for 3 years, living in our suburban house on Maple Street in Riverside. I spent my days managing Derek's used car dealership, handling the books, answering phones, and trying to keep his business running while he played golf and made deals over expensive lunches. I was good at it, really good, but Derek never saw it that way. Every morning, I'd wake up at 6 to make his coffee exactly how he liked it, black with 1 sugar, served in the blue mug his mother had given him. I'd iron his shirts while he showered, pack his lunch while he got dressed, and listen to him complain about customers, employees, or whatever else was bothering him that day. I thought I was being a good wife. I thought that's what marriage looked like. But Derek had other ideas about what made a good wife. He wanted someone who looked perfect at his business dinners, who laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny, who never questioned his decisions or challenged his authority. He wanted someone who made him look successful without actually being successful herself. And for 3 years I tried to be that person, even though it felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit. The cracks in our marriage started small. Derek would make little comments about my appearance, my cooking, my opinions. He'd correct me in front of his friends, roll his eyes when I spoke, or simply ignore me altogether. When I suggested taking a college course, he laughed and said I was too old to go back to school. When I mentioned wanting to do something more meaningful with my life, he'd remind me how lucky I was to have him, how most women would kill for the life he'd given me. But the real breaking point came on a rainy Thursday in March. I was at the dealership, as usual, when a customer came in disputing a contract. Derek was out playing golf, so I handled it myself, reading through the paperwork, finding the error, and negotiating a solution that satisfied everyone. The customer left happy, and I felt proud of myself for the first time in months. When Derek returned and heard what had happened, he was furious. Not because I'd done something wrong, but because I'd done something right. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin, and hissed, "Don't you ever try to play lawyer again. You're not smart enough for that, and you never will be." That night, he spent dinner telling me all the ways I'd probably screwed up the deal, all the money I'd probably cost him, all the reasons why I should stick to answering phones and filing papers. I lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, Derek's words echoing in my head. But instead of feeling defeated, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Anger. Real. Burning anger at being treated like I was worthless. Like my intelligence and instincts meant nothing. I thought about that contract dispute, about how easily I'd understood the legal language, about how natural it had felt to negotiate and solve problems. Maybe Derek was wrong. Maybe I was smart enough. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I went to the Riverside Community College website and looked up their pre-law program. I read about course requirements, application deadlines, and transfer opportunities. I imagined myself in a classroom, learning, growing, becoming more than just Derek's wife. For the first time in years, I felt excited about my future. When I mentioned it to Derek that evening, he didn't even look up from his newspaper. "Sarah, we've been through this. You're 28 years old. You missed your chance for all that college nonsense. Besides, we can't afford it, and I need you at the dealership." But I'd already looked into the finances. We could afford it if we cut back on Derek's golf membership and expensive dinners. We could afford it if he actually saw me as a partner worth investing in. The fight that followed was unlike anything we'd ever had. Derek shouted that I was being selfish, that I was abandoning my responsibilities, that I was living in a fantasy world. He called me naive, impractical, and worst of all, stupid. He said I'd never make it through college, that I'd embarrass myself and him, that I should focus on what I was actually good at, which according to him wasn't much. But something had shifted in me. Instead of backing down, I stood my ground. I told him I was going to apply regardless of what he thought. I told him I was tired of being treated like a child, tired of having my dreams dismissed, tired of being told I wasn't good enough. The more I spoke, the angrier he got, until finally he stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. He came back 3 hours later, drunk and meaner than I'd ever seen him. He cornered me in the kitchen, his face inches from mine, and delivered the words that would haunt me for months but ultimately set me free. "You want to know the truth, Sarah? You're broke and stupid. You'll always be broke and stupid. And when you fail at this college thing, because you will fail, you'll come crawling back to me, because you have nowhere else to go. No one else would want you." Those words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my knees buckle, felt tears I'd been holding back for years finally spill over. But even as I cried, even as Derek stood there looking satisfied with himself, I knew something had changed forever. I couldn't unknow what I now knew about myself. I couldn't unfeel the excitement I'd felt reading about those law courses. I couldn't go back to being the woman who believed she deserved to be treated like she was nothing. The next morning, Derek acted like nothing had happened. He wanted his coffee in the blue mug, his shirt ironed perfectly, his lunch packed just so. But I wasn't the same person who had been doing those things for 3 years. I made his coffee, but I also printed out the college application. I ironed his shirt, but I also researched scholarship opportunities. I packed his lunch, but I also called my best friend Jessica Chen, who lived in Los Angeles, and asked if I could visit her that weekend. Jessica had been my roommate in community college before I married Derek. She'd gone on to finish her bachelor's degree and was working as a social worker in downtown LA. When I told her what had happened, what Derek had said, what I was planning to do, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Sarah, I've been waiting for this phone call for 3 years. I've been waiting for you to remember who you used to be. That weekend in Los Angeles changed everything." Jessica lived in a small apartment in a diverse neighborhood where people walked to work and grabbed coffee from street vendors and talked about books and ideas and dreams. It was the opposite of the suffocating suburban bubble Derek had created for us. Over dinner at a little Vietnamese restaurant, Jessica told me about her work helping domestic violence survivors navigate the legal system. She told me about women who had been told they were worthless, who had been isolated and controlled, who had found the courage to rebuild their lives. "You know what they all have in common?" Jessica asked, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. They all thought they weren't smart enough, strong enough, good enough to make it on their own. But they were wrong, just like you're wrong about yourself. I spent that weekend walking through UCLA's campus, sitting in on a pre-law class Jessica had arranged for me to audit, and talking to women who had left marriages, gone back to school, and built careers they never thought possible. By Sunday evening, I knew what I had to do. I just didn't know if I had the courage to do it. The conversation with Derek happened the following Tuesday. I had filled out the college application, researched divorce attorneys, and opened my own bank account. I had also practiced what I was going to say, because I knew I'd only get one chance to say it right. When Derek came home from the dealership, I was sitting at the kitchen table with all my paperwork spread out in front of me. "What's all this?" he asked, loosening his tie and grabbing a beer from the refrigerator. His tone was casual, like he was asking about the weather, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "I'm leaving," I said simply. "I'm filing for divorce, going back to school and starting over." Derek laughed, actually laughed, like I'd just told him the funniest joke he'd ever heard. "Sarah, come on. We've been through this. You're not going anywhere. You don't have the money, you don't have the skills, and you certainly don't have the spine." But I wasn't the same woman who had broken down in this kitchen a week earlier. I had spent the last 7 days remembering who I was before Derek, remembering the girl who had gotten straight A's in high school, who had tutored other students in math and English, who had dreams bigger than being someone's wife. I had spent the week reconnecting with that person, and she was stronger than Derek had ever given her credit for. "I've already retained an attorney," I said, sliding the divorce papers across the table. "I've applied to UC Berkeley's pre-law program. I've arranged to stay with Jessica until I can get my own place. And I've documented 3 years of emotional abuse, including last week when you grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises." Derek's face went through several changes. Confusion, then anger, then something that looked almost like fear. "You can't be serious. You'll never make it without me. You have no idea how hard the world is for women like you." "Women like me?" I stood up, gathering my papers. "You mean women who are intelligent, capable, and tired of being told they're not?" "You're right, Derek. I don't know how hard it's going to be. But I know how hard it's been staying here, and I'd rather fail trying to build something real than succeed at being your shadow." I walked toward the door, my hands shaking but my voice steady. Derek followed me, his tone shifting from dismissive to pleading to angry again. "Sarah, think about what you're throwing away. Think about this house, this life, this security. Think about what people will say." I turned back to face him one last time. "I'm thinking about what I'll say about myself in 10 years. I'm thinking about whether I'll be proud of the woman I..." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I became or ashamed of the woman I stayed. I picked up my suitcase, the one I'd packed that morning while he was at work. I'm thinking about how it will feel to be called smart instead of stupid, successful instead of broke. And then I left. I walked out of that house, out of that marriage, out of that life that had felt like a prison. Derek shouted after me, called me every name he could think of, predicted every possible failure. But his words couldn't touch me anymore, because I was no longer the woman who believed them. The drive to Los Angeles took 3 hours, but it felt like a journey between 2 completely different worlds. With every mile, I felt lighter, freer, more like myself. When I finally pulled into Jessica's apartment complex, she was waiting on the steps with a bottle of wine and a smile bigger than I'd seen in years. "How does it feel?" she asked, wrapping me in a hug that felt like coming home. "Terrifying," I admitted, "but also like I can finally breathe." That night, we sat on her tiny balcony overlooking the city lights, and I told her everything. About Derek's cruelty, about my dreams, about my fears, about the woman I hoped to become. Jessica listened without judgment, offering encouragement when I needed it, and honest advice when I needed that more. "Law school is going to be brutal," she warned me. "It's competitive, expensive, and designed to weed out people who aren't completely committed. Are you sure you're ready for that?" I thought about the question seriously. Was I ready to spend the next 4 years studying, struggling, probably failing sometimes? Was I ready to be surrounded by people who might be smarter, more prepared, more confident than I was. Was I ready to prove Derek wrong, not just to him, but to myself? I don't know if I'm ready, I said finally, but I know I'm done being afraid. The next morning I woke up in Jessica's spare room, sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Real, tangible hope for a future I was going to build with my own hands. I had no idea how difficult the next several years would be, how many times I'd want to quit, how many obstacles I'd face. But I also had no idea how strong I was, how much I was capable of achieving when I finally believed in myself. As I made coffee in Jessica's kitchen, I thought about Derek waking up alone in our house, probably still convinced I'd be back within a week. I thought about the woman I'd been yesterday, scared and small and trapped. And I thought about the woman I was going to become. The one who would someday stand in a courtroom and command the respect Derek had never given her. I had no way of knowing that 7 years later, that woman would face Derek across a courtroom, that his own lawyer would recognize her name and credentials, that she would finally have the power to hold him accountable for everything he'd done. All I knew was that I was finally free to find out who I could become, when no one was telling me I wasn't good enough. The journey was about to begin, and for the first time in years I couldn't wait to see where it would take me. Standing in that courtroom, watching Derek's world shift beneath his feet, I realized how far I'd traveled from the woman he once knew. The Sarah Thompson who had served him coffee every morning had vanished completely, replaced by Sarah Martinez, the attorney who specialized in cases just like the one that had destroyed my first marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me that Derek had hired one of the most expensive family law attorneys in California, only to find himself facing someone who had learned from the very best in the business. Robert Sterling cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, a nervous habit I'd observed during the 3 depositions we'd already conducted. He was a man accustomed to intimidating opposing counsel, with his reputation and his clients' deep pockets. Sterling and Associates had a particular way of handling divorces for wealthy men like Derek. They delayed proceedings, buried the other side in paperwork, and generally made the process so expensive and exhausting that most women simply gave up and accepted whatever settlement was offered. But Derek had made a critical error in his strategy. He'd assumed I was still the same person he'd married, the woman who backed down from confrontation, who apologized for taking up space, who believed his version of reality over her own instincts. He'd hired Sterling to intimidate and overwhelm me, not realizing that I'd spent the last 7 years learning exactly how men like Derek operated, and more importantly, how to beat them at their own game. The transformation hadn't been sudden or dramatic. It had been a slow, methodical rebuilding of everything Derek had tried to tear down. When I first arrived at UC Berkeley for orientation, I felt like an imposter wearing borrowed clothes. The other pre-law students seemed so confident, so prepared, so certain of their place in the world. Most of them were fresh out of undergraduate programs at prestigious universities, speaking casually about their fathers who were judges, or their mothers who ran nonprofit organizations, or their summers spent interning at major law firms. I was 28 years old, recently divorced, living on savings I'd managed to hide from Derek during the final months of our marriage. While my classmates talked about their study groups and networking events, I was calculating whether I could afford both textbooks and groceries that month. While they complained about their parents' expectations, I was working 25 hours a week at Corner Cafe, serving coffee to students who were 5 years younger than me and seemed infinitely more sophisticated. The academic work itself wasn't the problem. Despite Derek's constant assertions that I wasn't intelligent enough for higher education, I discovered that I had a natural aptitude for legal reasoning. Constitutional law made perfect sense to me. Contract analysis felt like solving puzzles I'd been preparing for my entire life. Civil procedure, which made some of my classmates break out in stress sweats, seemed straightforward and logical. What challenged me was everything else. The unspoken rules about how to dress, how to speak, how to network. The assumption that everyone had unlimited financial resources and family connections. The way professors called on students without warning, expecting them to have not just read the assigned cases, but to have researched the background and implications. The study groups that formed naturally around shared experiences I'd never had. My first semester grades were solid, but not spectacular. I earned mostly B's with a few A-minuses, which should have felt like a victory but instead left me questioning whether I belonged. My criminal law professor, Dr. Patricia Williams, noticed me struggling, and asked me to stay after class one afternoon in October. "Ms. Martinez," she said, organizing her papers with the precision of someone who'd been teaching for 30 years. "You contribute thoughtful insights to our discussions, and your written work shows genuine understanding of complex concepts. But you seem hesitant to fully engage. May I ask why?" I'd never been asked that question by a professor, or really by anyone in a position of authority. Derek had always told me what I was thinking, what I was feeling, what I was capable of. The idea that someone wanted to understand my perspective, rather than simply override it, was both liberating and terrifying. "I suppose I'm not sure I deserve to be here," I admitted, immediately regretting the vulnerability. Everyone else seems so much more prepared, so much more naturally suited to this. Dr. Williams studied me for a moment, her expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. "Can I share something with you? I was the first person in my family to attend college, let alone law school. I spent my first year convinced that someone would figure out I didn't belong and send me home. It took me far too long to realize that different backgrounds bring different strengths, not just different challenges." She pulled a book from her shelf and handed it to me. "This is about women who changed the legal profession, often starting from circumstances far more difficult than yours. I'd like you to read it, not for class, but for yourself. And I'd like you to consider that perhaps the reason you're here isn't despite your background, but because of it." That night, I sat in my tiny studio apartment, reading about women who had fought their way into courtrooms when it was illegal for them to practice law, who had challenged systems designed to exclude them, who had used their outsider status as a source of strength rather than shame. For the first time since starting law school, I began to think that maybe my unconventional path wasn't a disadvantage. Maybe it was exactly what would make me effective. The shift didn't happen overnight, but it did happen. I started speaking up more in class, offering perspectives that came from my real-world experience rather than theoretical knowledge. When we studied contract law, I could discuss the practical implications, because I'd actually negotiated business deals at Derek's dealership. When we analyzed family law cases, I understood the emotional and financial dynamics in ways that textbooks couldn't convey. My grades improved dramatically. By the end of my first year, I was earning mostly A's and had been invited to join the law review. More importantly, I'd found my voice and my confidence. The woman who had once apologized for having opinions now raised her hand first when professors asked difficult questions. The summer between my first and second year, I landed an internship with a small family law practice in Oakland. The firm specialized in representing women in contentious divorces, often against well-funded opponents who use the legal system as a weapon of continued abuse. It was exactly the kind of work Derek would have mocked as do-gooder nonsense, which made it feel even more meaningful to me. My supervising attorney was Elena Rodriguez, a woman in her 40s who had built her practice from nothing after leaving a prestigious corporate firm. She was brilliant, fearless, and completely unimpressed by opposing counsel who tried to intimidate her with their reputations or their clients' bank accounts. Watching her work was like getting a masterclass in how to use intelligence and preparation to level playing fields that had been designed to be uneven. "The law is just a tool," Elena told me during my first week. "It can be used to protect people or to harm them, to seek justice or to perpetuate injustice. The question isn't whether you're smart enough to understand the law. The question is whether you're brave enough to use it correctly." That summer, I worked on cases that looked remarkably similar to my own divorce. Women who had been told they were worthless, who had been financially isolated, who had been convinced they couldn't survive on their own. I wrote motions, researched precedents, and sat in depositions where I watched Elena systematically dismantle the strategies that men like Derek used to maintain control. One case in particular stayed with me. Our client was a woman named Maria Santos, who had been married to a successful contractor for 15 years. He had convinced her that she was too stupid to work outside the home, too unstable to manage money, too dependent to survive without him. He controlled every aspect of her life, from the grocery money, to the car keys, to the passwords on all their accounts. When Maria finally decided to leave, her husband immediately began a campaign to destroy her. He hid assets, claimed she was mentally unstable, and tried to use their children as leverage to force her back. His attorney was expensive, experienced, and ruthless. But Elena was better prepared, more creative, and absolutely relentless in her pursuit of justice. I watched Elena present evidence of financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and systematic control. I saw her use the husband's own arrogance against him, getting him to admit on the record that he had deliberately isolated Maria because he thought she was incapable of independent thought. I witnessed the moment when the judge, a woman who had clearly seen these tactics before, ruled decisively in Maria's favor. Afterward, Maria hugged me in the courthouse hallway, tears streaming down her face. "I never thought anyone would believe me," she whispered. "I never thought I deserved better." That night, I called Jessica from my apartment, barely able to contain my excitement about what I'd witnessed. "I found it," I told her. "I found what I'm supposed to do with my life." "Tell me," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "I'm going to be the lawyer women like us hire when their husbands think they're too stupid to fight back." Part 3. The original passion. The passion for justice hadn't appeared suddenly during law school. Looking back, I could trace it to moments throughout my childhood and early adulthood, when I'd instinctively stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. In high school, I'd been the student who challenged teachers when they made unfair assumptions about kids from working-class families. In community college, I'd tutored classmates who struggled with English because it wasn't their first language, staying late in the library to help them understand concepts that came easily to me. Even during my marriage to Derek, there had been signs of who I really was beneath the compliant surface. I remembered the time an elderly customer at the dealership had been pressured into buying an extended warranty he couldn't afford. Derek was out of the office, and the salesman was using high-pressure tactics that bordered on fraud. I'd intervened, explaining the contract terms honestly and helping the man understand that he was being manipulated. When Derek found out, he was furious. Not because I'd cost him money, which I hadn't, but because I'd acted independently, made decisions without his approval. "It's not your job to save everyone," he'd said. "It's your job to support this business and trust me to run it." But saving people, or at least helping them save themselves, felt more natural to me than anything else I'd ever done. During my second year of law school, I volunteered at a legal aid clinic that provided free advice to low-income clients. Most of the cases were straightforward: landlord disputes, consumer protection issues, simple contract problems. But occasionally we'd see women whose situations reminded me powerfully of my own past. There was Jennifer, whose husband had convinced her to sign over power of attorney and then used it to drain their joint accounts. There was Rosa, who had been told by her spouse that she had no rights because she wasn't a citizen, even though she'd been married to an American for 12 years. There was Patricia, whose ex-husband was using the court system to harass her, filing frivolous motions that forced her to hire attorneys she couldn't afford. Each of these women had been told they were powerless, that the system wouldn't help them, that they should be grateful for whatever scraps they were offered. Each of them had internalized those messages to some degree, approaching the legal clinic with the kind of apologetic demeanor I recognized from my own past. They expected to be dismissed, ignored, or blamed for their situations. What thrilled me was discovering how much their perspectives changed when someone took them seriously, explained their options clearly, and helped them understand their rights. Jennifer learned that she could challenge the power of attorney because it had been obtained through fraud. Rosa discovered that her citizenship status gave her far more protections than her husband had claimed. Patricia found out that there were specific laws designed to prevent the kind of harassment she was experiencing. I spent countless hours researching their cases, not because it was required for my coursework, but because I couldn't stop thinking about the look of relief in their eyes when they realized they weren't as powerless as they'd been told. I worked late into the night writing briefs, knowing that these women were counting on someone to take their problems seriously, perhaps for the first time in years. My family law professor, Professor Helen Rodriguez, noticed my dedication to the clinic and called me into her office during spring semester of my second year. Her office was lined with books about women's rights, civil liberties, and legal advocacy, and the walls displayed photos of her with various Supreme Court justices and civil rights leaders. "I've been watching your work at the clinic," she said, gesturing for me to sit in the comfortable chair across from her desk. Your supervising attorneys tell me you're exceptional at connecting with clients who have experienced domestic abuse or financial control. That's not a skill that can be taught. I felt a flush of pride, followed immediately by the familiar voice of self-doubt that sounded suspiciously like Derek. I just try to listen to them, I said. Most of them have been told their concerns aren't valid for so long that they struggle to articulate what they need. Professor Rodriguez leaned forward, her expression serious. Can I ask you something personal? Have you considered specializing in family law? The question shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. I'd been thinking about corporate law, or maybe civil rights litigation, areas that seemed more prestigious, more likely to impress people who still questioned whether I belonged in the legal profession. Family law was often dismissed as less intellectually rigorous, more emotional than analytical. I'm not sure, I admitted. I've heard that family law isn't taken as seriously as other specializations. Professor Rodriguez smiled, but it wasn't a happy expression. That's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps women from pursuing the areas where they could make the most difference. Family law affects more people's daily lives than any other area of legal practice. It determines whether children are safe, whether abuse victims can escape their situations, whether financial resources are distributed fairly after relationships end. She pulled a file from her desk drawer and opened it. I want to show you something. These are statistics about women who represent themselves in family court because they can't afford attorneys. 90% of them lose custody battles against represented spouses, even when there's documented evidence of abuse. 85% accept financial settlements that leave them in poverty, even when they're entitled to much more. The numbers were staggering, but what struck me more was Professor Rodriguez's passion as she discussed them. She wasn't just reciting statistics. She was describing a systematic failure that destroyed lives every day. Now let me show you the outcomes when those same women have competent legal representation, she continued, flipping to another page. When attorneys who understand both the law and the dynamics of abusive relationships represent these clients, the success rates increase dramatically. Good family law attorneys don't just win cases, they literally save lives. I thought about Maria Santos, about the look of disbelief and gratitude when Elena had secured her freedom and financial security. I thought about Jennifer and Rosa and Patricia, about how their entire futures had changed when someone with legal knowledge had taken their problems seriously. The attorneys who do this work well, Professor Rodriguez continued, are often women who understand what it feels like to be told you're not smart enough, strong enough, or worthy enough to fight for yourself. They bring both intellectual rigor and genuine empathy to cases that require both. She was describing me, I realized. Not the woman Derek had tried to convince me I was, but the woman I had always been underneath his manipulation. The woman who couldn't walk past injustice without stopping to help. The woman who felt genuinely angry when people with power used it to hurt people without power. There's something else you should know, Professor Rodriguez said, closing the file. Family law is actually one of the most intellectually demanding areas of practice. You have to understand not just legal precedents, but psychology, economics, tax law, real estate, business valuation, and about a dozen other specializations. The attorneys who do it well are among the sharpest legal minds I've ever encountered. That evening, I walked across campus thinking about everything Professor Rodriguez had said. The UC Berkeley campus was beautiful in the late afternoon light, with students sprawled on the grass studying or playing frisbee or just enjoying the California sunshine. These students looked so young to me, so confident in their right to be there, so certain of their bright futures. I thought about my own future, about the kind of attorney I wanted to become. I could pursue corporate law, making excellent money helping large companies navigate regulations and mergers. I could go into civil rights litigation, working on important constitutional issues that might make headlines. I could even consider academia, following in Professor Rodriguez's footsteps, and teaching the next generation of lawyers. But when I imagined myself in 10 years, the vision that felt most compelling was sitting across from a woman who had been told she was worthless, helping her understand that she had options, that the system could work for her instead of against her. I imagined the moment when she realized she wasn't powerless, that she could build a better life for herself and her children. That night, I called Elena Rodriguez at her Oakland practice. I hadn't spoken to her since my internship ended, but she remembered me immediately. "Sarah!" How's your second year going? It's going well, I said. Actually, I'm calling because I've been thinking about what you told me last summer, about using the law correctly. I think I want to specialize in family law. There was a pause, and then Elena's voice, warm with approval. I was hoping you'd come to that conclusion. When can you start working with us again? I can start this weekend, I said, surprised by my own certainty. I want to learn everything you can teach me. Good, Elena said. Because I've got a case I think you'd find interesting. It's a woman whose husband convinced her she was too stupid to manage her own affairs. Sound familiar? I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in months. Very familiar. What makes him think he can get away with that? Oh, you know, Elena said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. He's rich, he's arrogant, and he's hired Sterling and Associates to intimidate her into giving up. Men like that always assume their money and their lawyers can overwhelm women like us. Women like us? Women who've been underestimated their entire lives and are tired of it. Women who know exactly how these tactics work because we've lived through them. Women who've learned to use our supposed weaknesses as strengths. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Derek had actually done me a favor, though he'd never intended to. By trying to convince me I was broken and stupid, he'd shown me exactly what I was capable of becoming. Smart enough to outthink him, strong enough to outfight him, and wise enough to help other women do the same. Part 4. The authority rejection. The law school environment should have been supportive, a place where intelligence was valued and hard work was rewarded. Instead, I quickly discovered that the legal profession carried its own set of biases and assumptions about who belonged and who didn't. The rejection wasn't always overt, but it was constant and exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated. During my second semester, I enrolled in Professor Michael Davidson's constitutional law course, widely considered one of the most challenging and prestigious classes in the curriculum. Professor Davidson was a Harvard Law graduate who had clerked for a Supreme Court justice before joining the Berkeley faculty. His course was known for rigorous Socratic method questioning and was considered essential preparation for anyone planning to pursue appellate litigation. The class was held in the largest lecture hall, with tiered seating that made it feel more like a theater than a classroom. Professor Davidson would stride across the front of the room, firing questions at students without warning, expecting not just correct answers, but sophisticated analysis that demonstrated deep understanding of constitutional principles and their historical development. I had prepared meticulously for each class, reading not just the assigned cases but the historical background, the dissenting opinions, and the subsequent decisions that had built upon or overruled the precedents we were studying. I felt confident in my understanding of the material and eager to participate in the kind of intellectual discourse that had drawn me to law school in the first place. The first time Professor Davidson called on me, I was ready. The case was Griswold versus Connecticut, involving the right to privacy in marriage and contraception access. I had spent hours analyzing not just the majority opinion, but the concurring opinions that laid the groundwork for later reproductive rights decisions. Ms. Martinez, Professor Davidson said, his voice carrying across the lecture hall. Please explain the constitutional basis for the court's decision in Griswold. I stood, as was traditional in his class, and began my analysis. The court found that the Connecticut statute violated the right to privacy in marriage, which they derived from penumbras formed by emanations of specific guarantees in the Bill of Rights. Stop, Professor Davidson interrupted, his hand raised like a traffic cop. Ms. Martinez, you're reciting the language from the opinion. I asked you to explain the constitutional basis. Do you understand the difference between recitation and analysis? The classroom fell silent. I felt heat rising in my cheeks but forced myself to continue. Yes, Professor. The constitutional basis is that while the word privacy doesn't appear in the Constitution, the court found that various amendments, when read together, create zones of privacy that government cannot invade. The First Amendment's protection of free speech, the Third Amendment's prohibition on quartering soldiers, the Fourth Amendment's search and seizure protections. That's still recitation, Ms. Martinez. You're telling me what the court said, not whether they were correct to say it. Do you have an opinion about whether Griswold was correctly decided? Or are you only capable of summarizing what other people have thought? The question was designed to humiliate, and it worked. Around me, I could see other students shifting in their seats, some looking sympathetic, others seeming relieved that they weren't the target. I knew that Professor Davidson was testing me, but the public nature of the questioning felt deliberately cruel. I believe Griswold was correctly decided, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, because the alternative would be to allow government regulation of the most intimate aspects of married life. The specific enumerated rights in the Constitution suggest a broader principle of personal autonomy that would be meaningless if it didn't extend to reproductive choices. Professor Davidson studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. And what do you say to critics who argue that the court was making law rather than interpreting it? That they found rights that exist nowhere in the constitutional text? This was the heart of constitutional interpretation, the tension between textual literalism and broader principles of liberty. I had thought about this extensively, not just in abstract terms, but in connection to my own experience of having my autonomy systematically undermined. I would say that's a false choice, Professor. The Constitution establishes a framework for protecting individual liberty against government overreach. If we interpret that framework so narrowly that it can't address new forms of government intrusion, then we've failed to honor the founders' broader vision of protected rights. Interesting, Professor Davidson said, though his tone suggested it was anything but. And you base this interpretation on your extensive study of constitutional history and judicial philosophy? The question was loaded with implication. He was suggesting that my opinion wasn't grounded in serious scholarship, that I was speaking from emotion rather than intellectual rigor. It was exactly the kind of dismissal I'd experienced from Derek, wrapped in academic language but carrying the same essential message. You're not smart enough to have opinions worth taking seriously. I base it on my reading of the constitutional text, the historical context of its adoption, and 2 centuries of judicial interpretation, I replied. I also base it on my understanding that constitutional principles have to be capable of addressing contemporary challenges, or they become meaningless abstractions. Professor Davidson nodded curtly and moved on to another student, but the damage was done. He had established that my contributions to class discussion would be scrutinized more harshly than others, that my preparation and insights would be treated with skepticism rather than intellectual curiosity. The pattern continued throughout the semester. While other students were allowed to offer tentative opinions or explore ideas through discussion, my responses were dissected for flaws and subjected to aggressive, follow-up questioning. When I made strong arguments, Professor Davidson would push back harder. When I admitted uncertainty, he would suggest that I hadn't prepared adequately. The worst incident came during our study of employment discrimination cases. We were discussing a Supreme Court decision about workplace harassment, and Professor Davidson asked the class to consider whether the court's analysis adequately protected workers from hostile work environments. Several male students offered opinions about the legal standards and evidentiary requirements. Their comments were met with thoughtful follow-up questions and opportunities to develop their arguments. When I raised my hand to contribute, Professor Davidson called on me with what seemed like reluctance. Professor, I think the court's analysis doesn't adequately account for the psychological impact of sustained harassment, I said. The legal standard focuses on whether a reasonable person would find the behavior offensive, but it doesn't consider how victims often internalize the harassment and begin to question their own perceptions. Ms. Martinez, Professor Davidson replied, his voice carrying a note of condescension that made me want to sink into my chair, are you perhaps speaking from personal experience rather than legal analysis? Because this is a law school classroom, not a therapy session. The comment landed like a physical blow. Around me, students stared or looked away, uncomfortable with the obvious inappropriateness of the professor's response. He had essentially accused me of being unable to separate personal experience from intellectual analysis, suggested that my contributions were emotional rather than scholarly. But something had changed in me during the months since leaving Derek. Instead of backing down or apologizing, I felt a familiar anger rising. Not the helpless rage I'd felt during my marriage, but the focused determination that had gotten me through my divorce and into law school. Actually, Professor, I said, my voice calm but firm, I'm speaking from my analysis of the empirical research on harassment victims, which shows consistent patterns of self-doubt and reality questioning that the legal standard doesn't address. If you'd like me to cite the specific studies, I'd be happy to do so. Professor Davidson's expression shifted slightly, surprise replacing condescension. "That won't be necessary," he said curtly, and moved on to another topic. After class, several students approached me in the hallway. A woman named Amanda Foster, who I'd barely spoken to before, fell into step beside me as I walked toward the library. "That was incredible," she said quietly. "I can't believe he said that to you." "It wasn't the first time," I admitted. "He's been questioning my contributions all semester." Amanda nodded knowingly. "He does that to women, especially women who seem to have real-world experience. It's like he thinks we're contaminating the pure intellectual environment with our messy actual knowledge." "Have you experienced it too?" "Not as directly, but I've watched him do it to others. There's a reason his classes have such high dropout rates among women students. He makes it clear that we're not really welcome." That evening, I sat in my apartment thinking about Professor Davidson's behavior and my response to it. The old Sarah would have absorbed his criticism, assumed he was right to question her qualifications, maybe even dropped the class to avoid further humiliation. But the woman I was becoming refused to be intimidated by academic bullying, even when it came from someone with impressive credentials and institutional authority. I made an appointment to see Professor Helen Rodriguez during her office hours the next day. When I explained what had been happening in Professor Davidson's class, her expression grew increasingly grim. "Unfortunately, this doesn't surprise me," she said. "Michael has a pattern of being particularly harsh with women students, especially those who bring life experience to their legal analysis. Some faculty members seem to believe that law school should be purely theoretical, disconnected from the real-world impact of legal decisions. Should I file a complaint?" I asked. Professor Rodriguez considered the question carefully. "You could, and you'd have grounds. But I'll be honest with you. The process is lengthy, often ineffective, and might hurt your reputation more than his. What I'd suggest instead is that you document everything, continue to excel in the class despite his behavior, and use the experience to develop the thick skin you'll need as a practicing attorney." "The thick skin?" "Sarah, what you're experiencing in that classroom is mild compared to what you'll face in practice. Opposing counsel will try to intimidate you. Judges might question your competence based on your gender or your background. Clients might assume you're not as qualified as male attorneys. Learning to respond with confidence and professionalism the way you did yesterday is one of the most valuable skills you can develop." She was right, of course. Professor Davidson's behavior was preparing me, inadvertently, for the challenges I'd faced throughout my career, but it was also crystallizing my understanding of why I wanted to practice family law. Women facing divorce or custody battles often encountered exactly this kind of systematic dismissal of their intelligence and credibility. They needed attorneys who understood not just the law, but the psychological warfare that accompanied it. I finished Professor Davidson's course with an A-, despite his obvious reluctance to acknowledge the quality of my work. More importantly, I finished it with a clearer sense of my own intellectual strengths, and a determination to use them in service of clients who had been told they weren't smart enough to understand their own legal situations. Years later, when I sat across from Derek in that courtroom, I would think about Professor Davidson and his assumption that my life experience made me less qualified to understand the law. I would remember how he'd tried to make me doubt my own intelligence and analysis. And I would be grateful that he'd failed, because his rejection had only made me more determined to prove that women like me belonged exactly where we were. In courtrooms, fighting for justice, refusing to be intimidated by men who thought their credentials made them superior to our experience. Part 5. The departure decision. The choice to leave my old life completely wasn't just about Derek or even about law school. It was about recognizing that I couldn't build the woman I wanted to become, while still trying to maintain relationships and situations that demanded I stay small. The process of leaving wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was a series of deliberate decisions that each required me to choose my future over my familiar past. The first major decision came during winter break of my second year. I had been commuting between Los Angeles and Riverside, trying to maintain some connection to the life I'd known while building my new identity as a law student. I still owned furniture and personal belongings in storage units near Derek's house. I still had friends in Riverside who knew me as Sarah Thompson, Derek's ex-wife, the woman who had finally gotten brave enough to leave, but might still come back. Jessica had been encouraging me to make a clean break for months. "You're living in two worlds," she pointed out during one of our weekly phone calls. "You're trying to be this confident law student in Berkeley and this apologetic former wife in Riverside. You can't fully become who you're meant to be if you're still holding on to who you used to be." The wake-up call came when I ran into Derek's mother Carol at a grocery store in Riverside. I was there picking up some items I'd left at a friend's house, trying to avoid the places where I might encounter my former life. But Riverside was a small city, and encounters were inevitable. Carol had always been polite to me during my marriage, but I'd sensed her relief when Derek and I divorced. She'd never thought I was good enough for her son, and my leaving had confirmed her assessment that I was unstable and unreliable. When she saw me in the produce section, her expression shifted from surprised to something that looked almost like pity. "Sarah," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "How are you doing?" "I'm doing well," I replied, immediately hating how defensive I sounded. "I'm in my second year of law school at UC Berkeley." Carol's eyebrows rose slightly, as if the idea of me in law school was particularly surprising. "That's nice, dear. Derek mentioned you were taking some classes." Taking some classes. As if 3 years of rigorous legal education was a hobby, something I was doing to fill time rather than preparing for a serious career. The dismissal was subtle but unmistakable, and it triggered all the old feelings of inadequacy that I thought I'd moved beyond. "Actually, I'm pursuing my Juris Doctor degree," I said, my voice stronger. "I'll be graduating next year and taking the bar exam." "Well, that's ambitious," Carol replied, her tone suggesting that ambition in women was something to be managed rather than celebrated. "I hope it works out for you." As she walked away, pushing her cart toward the checkout line, I stood among the oranges and apples feeling like I'd been transported back in time. The confidence I'd built at Berkeley, the intellectual respect I'd earned from professors and classmates, the growing certainty about my career path, all of it felt suddenly fragile in the face of Carol's polite skepticism. That night, I called Elena Rodriguez at her Oakland practice. I needed to hear the voice of someone who knew the woman I was becoming, not the woman I used to be. "Sarah," she said, her voice warm with genuine pleasure. "I was just thinking about you. How's the semester going?" "It's going well academically," I said. "But I think I'm struggling with something else. I keep trying to maintain connections to my old life, and every time I do, I feel like I'm moving backward instead of forward." Elena was quiet for a moment, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. She was probably working late, as she often did when preparing for complex cases. "Can I tell you something about my own experience?" she said finally. "When I left corporate law to start this practice, I kept trying to maintain relationships with my former colleagues. I thought I could prove to them that I hadn't made a mistake, that family law was just as intellectually rigorous as corporate transactions. What happened? I wasted 2 years trying to get approval from people who would never respect what I was doing. They saw family law as lesser work, women's work, something that wasn't worth their attention. It wasn't until I stopped seeking their validation that I could fully commit to the work I actually cared about." Her words resonated deeply. I realized that my attempts to maintain connections in Riverside weren't just about nostalgia or sentiment. They were about seeking approval from people who had never valued my intelligence or potential, people who saw my success as an aberration rather than a natural result of my capabilities. "The hardest part," Elena continued, "was accepting that some people would never see me the way I wanted them to see me. But you know what I discovered? Once I stopped trying to prove myself to them, I had so much more energy to focus on becoming excellent at what I actually wanted to do." That weekend, I drove back to Riverside with a clear purpose. I was going to collect my remaining belongings, close my storage units, and end my last financial ties to the city where I'd lived as Derek's wife. It felt like performing surgery on my own life, cutting away parts that had once seemed essential but were now preventing healthy growth. My friend Karen, who had been holding some of my furniture in her garage, helped me load everything into a rented truck. She'd been supportive during my divorce and had celebrated when I got into law school, but I could see questions in her eyes as I packed up items that represented the last traces of my old life. "Are you sure about this?" she asked as we carried my grandmother's rocking chair to the truck. Once you move everything to the Bay Area, it's going to be harder to come back. That's the point, I said, though I tried to keep my voice gentle. Karen meant well, and I didn't want to hurt her feelings. I think I need to fully commit to the person I'm becoming instead of trying to keep one foot in who I used to be. Karen nodded, though I could see she didn't entirely understand. She had built a comfortable life in Riverside, married her high school sweetheart, and found satisfaction in the familiar rhythms of small city life. My choice to abandon everything familiar probably seemed unnecessarily dramatic to her, maybe even ungrateful for the security I was giving up. As we finished loading the truck, Karen handed me an envelope. "This came to my address last week," she said. "It's from Derek." I stared at the envelope, my name written in Derek's familiar handwriting. For a moment, I felt the old anxiety rising, the automatic assumption that Derek's contact meant trouble or criticism. Then I remembered who I was now, who I was choosing to become, and opened it calmly. Inside was a brief note and a check for $800. The note read, "Sarah, I found some old jewelry of yours when I was cleaning out the garage. I sold it and thought you should have the money. Hope you're doing well. Derek." The gesture should have felt generous, but instead it felt like one final attempt to maintain some kind of connection, to remind me that he still had power to give or withhold things I might need. The old Sarah would have felt grateful, maybe even called to thank him. The woman I was becoming recognized it for what it was, a test to see if I was still the person who could be bought with small kindnesses after years of cruelty. I handed the check back to Karen. "Would you mind depositing this and donating it to the women's shelter downtown? I don't want to be connected to Derek financially, even indirectly." Karen looked surprised but took the check without argument. As I drove away from her house that afternoon, truck loaded with my possessions, I felt lighter than I had in months. I wasn't just moving furniture, I was completing a transformation that had been years in the making. The drive back to the Bay Area took 4 hours, and I spent most of it thinking about the choices that had brought me to this point. 2 years earlier, I had been a woman who apologized for having opinions, who assumed that other people's assessment of my capabilities was more accurate than my own experience. Now I was someone who could stand up to intimidating professors, who could analyze complex legal principles with confidence, who could make difficult decisions about her own life without seeking permission from people who had never supported her dreams. The apartment I'd found in Oakland was small, but filled with light from large windows that faced east toward the hills. It was nothing like the suburban house I'd shared with Derek, with its carefully coordinated furniture and his mother's disapproving presence in every decorative choice. This space was entirely mine, from the secondhand desk where I studied to the kitchen table where I spread out case briefs and legal research. That first night in my fully independent space, I called my mother for the first time in 6 months. Linda Martinez had been quietly supportive of my divorce but openly skeptical about law school. She worried that I was taking unnecessary risks, that I should focus on finding a nice man to marry rather than pursuing a career that seemed impossibly challenging for someone from our background. "Mija," she said when she heard my voice, "I was wondering when you'd call. How are your classes going?" "They're going really well, Mom. I'm in my 2nd year now, and I've been working with a family law practice in Oakland. I think I've found what I want to do with my career." There was a pause, and I could picture my mother in her small kitchen, probably folding laundry while we talked, the way she always multitasked during phone conversations. "That's good, honey. And are you meeting any nice men at school?" The question was so predictable that I almost laughed. My mother's generation had been taught that a woman's success was measured primarily by her ability to attract and keep a good husband. My educational achievements were interesting, but they weren't the real goal. "I'm not looking for a relationship right now, Mom. I'm focused on my studies and building my career." "But you're 30 years old, Sarah. If you wait too much longer, it's going to be harder to find someone." I understood my mother's concern, rooted in her own experience of limited options and economic insecurity. But I also knew that I couldn't make her understand how different my life looked from the inside. I wasn't postponing happiness until I found another man. I was actively creating the life I wanted, one that would belong entirely to me regardless of my relationship status. "I know you worry about me," I said gently. But I'm happier now than I've been in years. I'm good at this work, Mom. I'm really good at it. I just don't want you to end up alone, she said, her voice soft with genuine concern. I won't be alone. I'll have work that matters, friends who respect me, and a life I built myself. That doesn't sound lonely to me. After we hung up, I sat in my small living room thinking about the different ways people defined success and security. My mother equated safety with attachment to a man who could provide financially. Derek had equated my worth with my willingness to serve his needs and affirm his ego. Even some of my law school classmates seemed to view their education primarily as a path to prestigious jobs that would impress others rather than work that aligned with their values. But I was discovering that real security came from knowing I could take care of myself, that my intelligence and capabilities were genuine rather than dependent on other people's approval. The woman who had left Derek with one suitcase and a bank account containing $1,200 was now someone who could analyze complex legal problems, who was respected by professors and supervisors, who was building expertise in an area of law that could genuinely help people. The next major test of my commitment to this new life came during spring semester when I received an unexpected phone call from Nathan, Derek's younger brother. Nathan had always been more diplomatic than Derek, and we'd maintained a cordial relationship even after the divorce. But I hadn't heard from him in over a year, so his call caught me off guard. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying that careful tone people use when they're about to ask for something complicated. "I hope you don't mind me calling. Derek gave me your number." "Of course not," I said, though I immediately felt wary. "How are you doing?" "I'm doing well, thanks. Listen, I'm calling because there's a situation I hoped you might be able to help with. Derek's been having some legal issues with the dealership, nothing too serious, but he needs to hire an attorney. He was wondering if you might have some recommendations, from your law school connections." The request was so absurd that I was temporarily speechless. Derek, who had spent years telling me I was too stupid to understand legal concepts, was now asking me to recommend an attorney to handle his business problems. The irony was almost too perfect. "Nathan," I said carefully, "I'm still a student. I don't have connections to business attorneys who could help Derek with whatever issues he's facing." "Right, of course. It's just that he thought maybe your professors might know someone, or maybe that law firm where you've been working." I could hear the discomfort in Nathan's voice. He knew how awkward this request was, but Derek had clearly sent him to make it anyway. It was typical Derek logic. He could dismiss my intelligence and capabilities while simultaneously trying to benefit from the connections and knowledge I was developing. "Nathan, I think Derek should hire his own attorney, based on his own research. I'm not comfortable being involved in his legal issues in any capacity." "I understand," Nathan said quickly. I told him it was a long shot. He's just really stressed about the whole situation. After I hung up, I realized that Derek's request represented something important about the changes in our relative positions. 3 years earlier, he had been the successful businessman while I was the dependent wife who couldn't be trusted with important decisions. Now he was facing legal problems he couldn't handle alone, while I was developing expertise that he recognized as valuable even if he couldn't bring himself to respect it openly. But what struck me more was my response to his request. The old Sarah might have felt obligated to help, might have worried that refusing would seem petty or vindictive. The woman I had become felt no obligation to assist someone who had spent years undermining her confidence and intelligence. I could be civil without being helpful, professional without being accommodating. The final step in my departure from my old life came at the end of that semester when I learned that Derek was getting remarried. Karen called to tell me the news, probably thinking I would want to know before I heard it from someone else. "Her name is Brittany Walsh," Karen said. "She's 26 and works at the bank downtown. The wedding is next month." I waited for some emotional reaction, some sense of loss or regret or even relief. Instead, I felt remarkably little. Derek's new relationship belonged to a different universe from the one I now inhabited. The man who had once defined my sense of self-worth was now just someone I used to know, someone whose choices had no impact on my daily life or future plans. "That's nice," I said, and I meant it. "I hope they're happy together." "Are you okay?" Karen asked, clearly surprised by my calm response. "I'm more than okay," I said. "I'm grateful. Derek getting remarried means he's moved on completely, which means I can too. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, working on a research project for Elena's firm, analyzing precedent cases for a custody dispute involving a mother whose ex-husband was trying to use her past oppression against her. The legal issues were complex, requiring careful analysis of medical privacy laws, family court procedures, and constitutional protections for parental rights. As I worked through the cases, highlighting relevant passages and taking notes on legal strategies, I realized that this was exactly where I wanted to be. Not at Derek's wedding, not in my old life in Riverside, not trying to maintain relationships with people who had never valued my intelligence or potential. I wanted to be in my small apartment, developing expertise that would help women protect their children and their futures. The woman Derek had married was someone who would arrange her life around his needs and preferences, who would find her identity in being his wife rather than in her own accomplishments. 3 years earlier, that woman had been me. Now she was someone else entirely, and I felt nothing but sympathy for what she didn't yet know about the man she was marrying. I had learned something crucial during my 2 years of rebuilding. You cannot become who you're meant to be while trying to maintain approval from people who preferred you small and dependent. Real transformation requires real departure, not just physical separation but emotional and psychological independence from the relationships and situations that demanded you diminish yourself. The Sarah who had left Derek with one suitcase had been brave but still uncertain, still carrying his voice in her head telling her she wasn't smart enough or strong enough to succeed on her own. The Sarah who sat in that Oakland apartment, analyzing complex legal problems and preparing for a career that would use every aspect of her intelligence and empathy, had finally silenced that voice completely. I was no longer leaving Derek or my old life. I had left them completely and irreversibly. I was no longer becoming someone new. I had become her. And the woman I had become was someone Derek never could have imagined. Someone his new wife might never have the courage to discover in herself. Someone I was proud to inhabit fully and unapologetically. The departure was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Law school had given me the tools and confidence I needed to build a career that would matter. Elena's mentorship had shown me how to use those tools in service of justice, rather than just professional advancement. My own experience had taught me to recognize the tactics that men like Derek used to maintain control and the strategies that could be used to defeat them. As I closed my laptop that night and prepared for bed, I thought about the woman I would be in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years. She would be someone who had built something meaningful from nothing, who had used her intelligence and determination to change lives, who had never again allowed anyone to convince her she was less than she was. That woman felt real and achievable in a way she never had when I was married to Derek, when I was trying to split my time between old relationships and new goals, when I was still seeking approval from people who had never wanted me to grow. The departure hadn't just been about leaving a marriage or a city. It had been about leaving behind every limitation that other people had tried to impose on my life. I fell asleep that night feeling completely at peace with my choices, completely committed to the path I had chosen, completely free from the need to be anyone other than exactly who I was becoming. The departure was finished. The real journey was just beginning. Law school's 3rd year brought challenges I hadn't anticipated, not just in academics but in confronting the brutal realities of the legal profession I was preparing to enter. The romantic notion of fighting for justice gave way to the harsh understanding that the system I was learning to navigate was often rigged against the very people I most wanted to help. My clinical work with Elena's firm had expanded from simple research projects to direct client contact, and I was discovering that every family law case was a study in human devastation. The clients who came through our doors weren't just dealing with divorce paperwork. They were survivors of psychological warfare, financial manipulation, and systematic control that had lasted for years or even decades. One case in particular shattered my remaining illusions about how the legal system protected vulnerable people. Our client was Dr. Anita Patel, an emergency room physician who had been married to another doctor for 12 years. Her husband, Richard Chen, was a successful cardiologist who earned significantly more money and had used that financial advantage to systematically isolate Anita from her own career and support systems. During their marriage, Richard had convinced Anita to work part-time so she could manage their household and care for their 2 young children. He controlled all their finances, claiming that his higher income made him better qualified to handle money management. He had gradually convinced her colleagues that she was unreliable, spreading stories about her supposed emotional instability, until her hospital shifts were reduced and her professional reputation damaged. When Anita finally decided to divorce Richard, she discovered the extent of his manipulation. He had been hiding income in offshore accounts for years, claiming financial hardship while maintaining a lifestyle that suggested significant wealth. He had used their joint credit cards to purchase expensive items that he then transferred to his parents' house, effectively stealing marital assets while making it appear that they had very little money. Most devastatingly, Richard had begun a campaign to paint Anita as an unfit mother. He documented every instance when she worked late at the hospital, characterizing her medical career as abandonment of their children. He secretly recorded conversations where Anita, exhausted from working double shifts and managing all household responsibilities, expressed frustration with their situation. He presented these recordings as evidence of mental instability. Elena assigned me to help prepare Anita's case, and I spent weeks documenting the financial abuse and gathering evidence of Richard's manipulation tactics. The work was emotionally exhausting, because I recognized so many of Richard's strategies from my own marriage: the gaslighting, the financial control, the systematic undermining of confidence. It was Derek's playbook, executed by someone with more money and professional credentials. What made the case even more difficult was watching how the legal system responded to Anita's situation. Richard had hired Thompson and Associates, one of the most expensive family law firms in the Bay Area, known for their aggressive tactics in high-asset divorces. Their strategy was simple: delay everything, make the process so expensive that Anita couldn't afford to continue, and gradually wear down her resistance until she accepted an unfavorable settlement. Richard's attorneys filed motion after motion, each one requiring hours of research and preparation time that cost Anita money she increasingly didn't have. They demanded extensive discovery, requiring Anita to produce years of financial records, medical files, and personal communications. They scheduled depositions at inconvenient times, forcing her to miss work and lose income. They challenged every expert witness Elena wanted to use, creating additional legal battles that drained both time and resources. Most frustratingly, they used Anita's medical career against her. They argued that her demanding work schedule made her an unsuitable primary caregiver, conveniently ignoring the fact that Richard had encouraged her to work extra shifts when he needed money for his hidden investments. They portrayed her dedication to saving lives as selfishness, her professional expertise as evidence that she cared more about her career than her children. I spent countless hours in law library, researching strategies to counter these tactics. I learned about financial discovery techniques, expert witness requirements, and the specific legal standards that applied to custody determinations. But I also learned about the practical realities that no textbook had prepared me for: how expensive litigation could bankrupt even middle-class families, how custody battles could last for years while children suffered, how the legal system's complexity often favored whoever could afford better representation. The breaking point came during Anita's deposition. Richard's lead attorney, Marcus Thompson, was a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of polished confidence that came from decades of intimidating opposing parties. He questioned Anita for 8 hours, dissecting every decision she had made during her marriage, every moment of fatigue or frustration she had ever expressed. "Dr. Patel," he said in his smooth baritone voice, "you've testified that you worked 60-hour weeks during much of your marriage. How exactly did you manage to be an involved mother while maintaining such a demanding schedule?" Anita, exhausted after hours of questioning, tried to explain that she had worked long hours because Richard had insisted they needed the money, that she had arranged her schedule to be home with the children whenever possible, that she had sacrificed career advancement opportunities to prioritize family time. "I see," Thompson replied, his tone suggesting he saw nothing of the sort. "So you're saying that working 60 hours a week was consistent with putting your children first?" "I'm saying that I did everything I could to balance my responsibilities as a mother and as a physician," Anita replied, her voice beginning to crack under the pressure. "Everything you could? including missing your daughter's school play to work an extra shift, including being called away from your son's birthday party for a medical emergency. Elena objected repeatedly, but Thompson had achieved his goal. He had taken Anita's dedication to saving lives and twisted it into evidence of maternal neglect. He had presented her professional achievements as character flaws, her financial contributions to the family as abandonment of her children. I watched this performance feeling sick with rage and recognition. This was exactly what Derek had done to me, though without the legal framework to make it official. He had taken my strengths and reframed them as weaknesses, my independence as selfishness, my ambitions as evidence that I was fundamentally flawed. That night, I called Jessica from my apartment, needing to talk to someone who understood both my personal history and my professional aspirations. I don't know if I can do this, I admitted. Watching what they're doing to Anita, seeing how the system can be used to destroy someone who's already been victimized, it's overwhelming. Jessica was quiet for a moment. As a social worker, she dealt with similar frustrations in her own field, watching bureaucratic systems fail the people they were supposed to protect. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "What would happen to Anita if you and Elena weren't representing her? If she was trying to navigate this alone, or with an overworked public defender?" I thought about the question seriously. Without competent representation, Anita would have been completely overwhelmed by Richard's legal strategy. She would have agreed to whatever settlement his attorneys proposed, probably losing custody of her children and most of her financial assets. She might have given up her medical career entirely, convinced that she was indeed an unfit mother who deserved to lose everything. "She'd be destroyed," I said. "Completely destroyed." "Right. So the question isn't whether the system is fair or whether bad people use it for evil purposes. The question is whether you're going to be part of the solution or walk away because it's too hard to watch." Jessica's words forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth about my motivations for pursuing family law. Part of me had been attracted to the field because I thought it would provide clear-cut opportunities to fight for justice, to be the hero in stories where good triumphed over evil. I had imagined courtroom victories where manipulative spouses were exposed and punished, where victims were vindicated and rewarded for their courage. The reality was much more complex and morally ambiguous. Most cases ended in settlements rather than trials, compromises that left everyone partially unsatisfied. Judges were overworked and often impatient with the emotional complexity of family disputes. The legal system's emphasis on documentation and procedure sometimes favored people who were good at manipulation over people who were simply trying to survive. But Jessica was right about the alternative. Without attorneys who understood the dynamics of abuse and financial control, women like Anita would be completely defenseless against men who used the legal system as a weapon. The choice wasn't between a perfect system and an imperfect one. It was between participating in an imperfect system that could sometimes achieve justice and walking away while victims were systematically destroyed. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into Anita's case with renewed determination. Instead of being discouraged by the system's flaws, I became obsessed with understanding how to work within those flaws to achieve the best possible outcomes. I researched every precedent case involving financial hiding, every successful strategy for proving parental alienation, every technique for presenting complex financial information in ways that judges could easily understand. Elena noticed my increased intensity and called me into her office one afternoon in late October. "You're working 18-hour days," she observed. "That's not sustainable, and it's not necessary." "Anita's case goes to trial in 3 months," I replied. "There's still so much preparation to do. There's always more preparation to do. The question is whether you're working efficiently or just working frantically." Elena leaned back in her chair, studying me with the kind of direct attention that made her such an effective attorney. "Can I share something about my own evolution as a lawyer?" I nodded, grateful for any wisdom she could offer. When I first started practicing family law, I took every case personally. Every client's pain became my pain. Every opposing attorney's tactic felt like a personal attack. I thought that level of emotional investment made me a better advocate. Didn't it? In some ways, yes. But it also made me less effective. When you're emotionally reactive, you make decisions based on anger rather than strategy. You exhaust yourself fighting battles that don't matter while missing opportunities that could actually help your client. Elena pulled a file from her desk drawer and opened it. This is from a case I handled 5 years ago. The opposing counsel used tactics very similar to what Thompson is doing with Richard Chen. Delay, distract, financially exhaust the client. I was so angry about their behavior that I responded to every motion, fought every delay, took every piece of bait they offered. What happened? We won, eventually. But the case took 18 months longer than it needed to, cost my client twice as much money, and exhausted both of us in the process. I learned that righteous anger, while emotionally satisfying, is often strategically counterproductive. Elena closed the file and looked at me directly. Anita needs you to be smart and strategic, not angry and reactive. She needs you to pick the battles that matter and ignore the ones that don't. She needs you to channel your passion into preparation rather than indignation. The conversation forced me to examine my own motivations more honestly. Part of my intensity around Anita's case came from genuine concern for her welfare and determination to achieve justice. But part of it came from my own unresolved anger about Derek's treatment of me, my need to prove that women like us could win against men like them. I began to approach the case differently, focusing on practical strategies rather than emotional responses. Instead of getting angry about Thompson's delay tactics, I used the extra time to develop more comprehensive financial analysis. Instead of responding defensively to their attacks on Anita's parenting, I gathered evidence that demonstrated her actual involvement in her children's lives. Instead of trying to prove that Richard was a terrible person, I focused on documenting his specific behaviors that affected custody and financial determinations. The shift in approach made me more effective and less exhausted. I was still working long hours, but they were productive hours focused on achievable goals rather than reactive hours spent on tasks that made me feel better but didn't help Anita's case. 3 weeks before trial, we achieved a breakthrough that validated this strategic approach. During financial discovery, I had noticed inconsistencies in Richard's expense reports that suggested he was hiding income through his medical practice. Instead of making accusations in court, I worked with a forensic accountant to trace the specific transactions and identify the hidden accounts. When we presented this evidence during settlement negotiations, Richard's attorneys were caught completely off guard. They had assumed that Anita's legal team was too under-resourced to conduct sophisticated financial analysis. The discovery of his hidden assets changed the entire negotiation dynamic and ultimately led to a settlement that gave Anita primary custody and a fair share of the marital estate. How did you know to look there? Elena asked me after the settlement conference. I remembered something Derek used to do, I said. He would pay personal expenses through the business account and then claim they were deductible business expenses. It occurred to me that Richard might be doing something similar but in reverse, claiming business income as personal expenses to hide it from the divorce. Elena smiled, but her expression was thoughtful. That's exactly the kind of insight that comes from lived experience. You understood Richard's tactics because you'd seen similar manipulation in your own life. That's why attorneys who've experienced these dynamics personally can be so effective for clients facing similar situations. The conversation made me realize that my background, which I had sometimes seen as a limitation or source of shame, was actually one of my greatest professional assets. I understood financial manipulation not just as a legal concept but as a lived reality. I could recognize gaslighting and emotional abuse because I had experienced them myself. I knew how it felt to be told you were crazy, stupid, or worthless by someone who claimed to love you. But more than that, I knew how it felt to discover that those messages were lies, to rebuild confidence in your own perceptions and capabilities, to develop the strength to fight back effectively. That knowledge couldn't be learned from textbooks or case studies. It came from surviving, recovering, and transforming pain into purpose. As my final semester of law school began, I realized that the reality check hadn't just been about understanding the legal system's limitations. It had been about understanding my own strengths and how to use them effectively. The naive idealism I had brought to law school had been replaced by something more valuable: practical wisdom about how to achieve justice within an imperfect system, and personal experience that made me uniquely qualified to represent clients who had been told they were powerless. The woman Derek had called broke and stupid was now someone who could outthink experienced attorneys, who could see patterns that others missed, who could use her intelligence and determination to protect other women from the kind of devastation she had once faced. The reality of legal practice was more complex than I had expected, but it was also more meaningful than I had dared to hope. Part 7, the persistence test. The months following law school graduation tested every aspect of my determination in ways I hadn't anticipated. Passing the bar exam was just the beginning. Finding my place in the legal profession as someone without family connections or inherited advantages required a different kind of persistence than anything I had experienced during my academic career. Elena had offered me a position at her Oakland practice, but the small firm could only afford to pay me a salary that barely covered my living expenses. I was grateful for the opportunity and the mentorship, but I knew that my long-term financial stability would require either building my own practice or joining a larger firm with more substantial resources. The challenge was that most major family law firms wanted attorneys with either prestigious law school credentials or family connections that could bring in wealthy clients. I had graduated in the top 20% of my class from a respected law school, but I wasn't Harvard Law Review, and I didn't have relatives who could refer high-net-worth divorce cases. What I did have was a growing reputation for thorough preparation and an unusual ability to connect with clients who had experienced financial or emotional abuse. Word was spreading through the Bay Area legal community about my work on complex custody cases and high-conflict divorces. But reputation and actual job opportunities were proving to be very different things. The first major test came when Sterling and Associates, the prestigious firm where Derek had hired his attorney, posted an opening for a family law associate. The position was exactly what I was looking for. Complex cases, sophisticated clients, excellent training opportunities, and a salary that would allow me to pay off my student loans within a reasonable time frame. I knew it was a long shot, but I decided to apply anyway. My resume was strong, my references were excellent, and I had specific experience with the kinds of cases the firm handled regularly. What I didn't anticipate was how the interview process would force me to confront assumptions about class, background, and who belonged in elite legal spaces. The firm's offices occupied the top 3 floors of a downtown San Francisco building with sweeping views of the bay. The reception area featured modern art that probably cost more than my annual salary, and the conference rooms were furnished with antiques that spoke of old money and established power. Everything about the environment communicated that this was a place for people who had always belonged in rooms like this. My interview was scheduled with Margaret Sterling, the firm's senior partner and the daughter of the founder. She was a woman in her early 50s, with the kind of effortless polish that came from a lifetime of private schools, summer houses, and social connections that opened doors automatically. She greeted me warmly, but with the slightly puzzled expression of someone trying to place me in a context that made sense to her. "Ms. Martinez," she said, settling into her chair with practiced elegance. "I've reviewed your resume, and your academic credentials are certainly impressive. Tell me about your decision to specialize in family law." I had prepared for this question, but sitting in that opulent office, I felt the familiar tension between honesty and strategic self-presentation. How much of my personal history should I reveal? How could I frame my background as an asset rather than a limitation? I'm drawn to family law because it's where legal expertise can have the most direct impact on people's daily lives, I began. During my clinical work, I discovered that I have a particular aptitude for cases involving financial complexity and custody disputes. "I see," Margaret replied, her tone neutral but attentive. "And where do you see yourself in 5 years? What are your long-term career goals?" "I'd like to develop expertise in high-asset divorce cases and complex custody matters. I'm particularly interested in cases that involve business valuation and financial discovery." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Our clients tend to be quite sophisticated, often professionals or business owners with substantial assets and complex family situations. They expect attorneys who can relate to their concerns and communicate effectively with their peer groups. Tell me about your background. Where did you grow up?" The question seemed casual, but I recognized it as a screening mechanism. She was trying to determine whether I came from the kind of background that would allow me to connect naturally with the firm's wealthy clientele. I grew up in Modesto, I said. My family didn't have much money, but they emphasized the importance of education and hard work. And what did your parents do for work? My mother was a housekeeper, and my father worked in a processing plant. I watched Margaret's expression carefully as I answered. She maintained professional courtesy, but I could see her mentally categorizing me as someone who might struggle to relate to clients who owned multiple homes and worried about tax strategies for their investment portfolios. That's admirable, she said. Self-made success stories are always inspiring. Now, many of our cases involve clients who are dealing with very public divorces, situations where discretion and social sensitivity are crucial. How do you think you'd handle representing someone whose case might be covered in the society pages? The question revealed the core of her concern. Sterling and Associates didn't just handle divorces. They managed the reputations and social standing of clients who moved in exclusive circles. They needed attorneys who understood the unspoken rules of high society, who could navigate country club politics and charity board dynamics. I think every client deserves representation that protects their privacy and dignity, I replied. Whether someone is a public figure or a private citizen, the goal is to achieve the best legal outcome while minimizing unnecessary exposure or embarrassment. Of course, Margaret said, but there's a difference between understanding that principle intellectually and having the instinct to navigate these situations effectively. Our clients often need attorneys who can anticipate social implications, not just legal ones. The interview continued for another 30 minutes, covering my experience with financial analysis, my approach to custody evaluations, and my familiarity with various aspects of family law practice. Margaret was professional throughout, but I could sense that she had already made her decision. I was qualified for the position, but I wasn't the right fit for their client base. 2 weeks later, I received a polite rejection letter thanking me for my interest and encouraging me to apply for future openings. The letter was gracious but final, and it forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about how class background affected career opportunities in elite legal practice. The rejection stung, but it also clarified something important about my professional goals. Did I want to spend my career trying to fit into spaces where my background was seen as a limitation? Or did I want to build a practice where my experiences were recognized as strengths? The answer came during a consultation with a potential client named Rebecca Torres, a high school teacher whose husband was a successful real estate developer. Rebecca had been referred to Elena's firm by a women's shelter, and she came to our Oakland office looking overwhelmed and apologetic. I don't know if I can afford a good attorney, she said during our initial meeting. My husband controls all our finances, and I don't even know what assets we have. Rebecca's situation was complex. Her husband, Carlos, owned multiple properties and had business interests that he claimed were struggling financially. He had convinced Rebecca that they were barely getting by, even though they lived in a $1 million house and he drove expensive cars. When Rebecca finally decided to seek a divorce, Carlos had immediately moved money to accounts she couldn't access and begun claiming that his businesses were worthless. What made the case particularly challenging was Carlos's strategy of portraying Rebecca as greedy and ungrateful. He hired an expensive attorney who painted her as a gold digger, who had married him for money and was now trying to destroy his business out of spite. The narrative was effective because it played into stereotypes about women who sought divorce from successful men. But I recognized the real dynamics immediately. Carlos was using classic financial abuse tactics, claiming poverty while maintaining wealth, hiding assets while crying poor, portraying his victim's quest for fair treatment as unreasonable greed. I had seen Derek use similar strategies, though with far fewer resources. More importantly, I understood how these tactics affected the victim psychologically. Rebecca apologized constantly, questioned her own perceptions, and seemed genuinely unsure whether she deserved any financial support after the divorce. She had internalized Carlos's messages about her worthlessness so completely that she was prepared to accept almost nothing rather than appear selfish. Rebecca, I said during our third meeting, I want you to understand something important. You've been married to Carlos for 15 years. You've contributed to his success by managing his household, raising his children, and supporting his career. You have legal rights to marital assets, regardless of what he's telling you. But he says the businesses are failing, she replied. He showed me paperwork that proves he's losing money. May I see that paperwork? When Rebecca produced the financial documents Carlos had shown her, I immediately spotted several red flags. The business losses he was claiming didn't match the lifestyle he was maintaining. The timing of certain transactions suggested that he was deliberately reducing his apparent income in preparation for divorce proceedings. Working with Elena and a forensic accountant, we spent 6 months unraveling Carlos's financial manipulation. We discovered that he had been transferring business assets to relatives, paying personal expenses through business accounts, and creating artificial losses to reduce his apparent net worth. The actual value of the marital estate was nearly 3 times what Carlos had claimed. But the most meaningful moment came when Rebecca began to understand how thoroughly she had been manipulated. During one of our preparation sessions, she looked up from a stack of financial documents and said, "He really did make me think I was crazy, didn't he?" "Yes," I replied. "That was deliberate. Men like Carlos are very good at making their wives question their own perceptions and judgment." "How did you know?" she asked. "How did you see through it so quickly?" The question forced me to articulate something I was still learning about my own professional identity. "I knew because I've been where you are. I've been married to a man who used money and manipulation to control me. I've been told I was stupid and worthless and should be grateful for whatever scraps I was offered." Rebecca stared at me for a moment, then asked quietly, "What happened? How did you get from there to here?" I decided I was tired of being told I wasn't smart enough to understand my own life. I went to law school, learned how the system works, and now I use that knowledge to help other women who've been told the same lies. The conversation with Rebecca crystallized my understanding of why Margaret Sterling's rejection had been, in retrospect, a gift. I didn't want to spend my career trying to prove I belonged in exclusive circles that valued pedigree over competence. I wanted to work with clients who needed attorneys who understood their experiences, who could recognize manipulation tactics because they had survived them. Over the following months, word spread about my work on Rebecca's case, and others like it. I began receiving referrals from therapists, social workers, and other attorneys who had clients with similar backgrounds. Women who had been financially abused, who had been told they were too stupid to understand business matters, who needed attorneys who could see through the sophisticated manipulation tactics that wealthy abusers used. The work was challenging but deeply satisfying. Each case required me to become an expert in whatever business or financial strategy the opposing party was using to hide assets or manipulate income. I learned about real estate development, medical practice management, technology startups, and investment strategies. But more than technical knowledge, I was developing something more valuable: the ability to translate complex financial information into strategies that protected my clients' interests. 6 months after the Sterling & Associates rejection, I received an unexpected phone call from Robert Sterling, Margaret's son and a partner in the firm. One of their clients was facing a particularly complex case involving a spouse who had extensive experience in financial manipulation, and their usual strategies weren't working. "We've heard excellent things about your work on high-conflict cases," Robert said. "Would you be interested in consulting on a matter that requires someone with your particular expertise?" The irony wasn't lost on me. The firm that had rejected me as not sophisticated enough for their clientele now wanted to hire me because I understood dynamics they couldn't navigate. My background, which Margaret had seen as a liability, had become a professional asset that even elite firms recognized as valuable. I agreed to consult on their case, not because I needed their validation, but because I was curious to see how my approach would work within their more formal environment. The case involved exactly the kind of financial manipulation I had become expert at detecting, and I was able to help their client achieve a settlement that recovered assets the opposing party had tried to hide. More importantly, the experience confirmed that I had found my professional niche. I was becoming known as the attorney you hired when your spouse was using sophisticated financial tactics to gain unfair advantage, when traditional divorce strategies weren't sufficient to protect your interests, when you needed someone who could think like an abuser to defeat an abuser. The persistence test hadn't just been about surviving rejection or proving my qualifications to skeptical employers. It had been about discovering that my greatest professional strengths came from the experiences that others might see as limitations. The woman Derek had called broke and stupid was now someone that elite law firms consulted when their own attorneys couldn't solve complex cases. Part 8, the competence building. By my second year of practice, I had developed a reputation that extended far beyond Elena's small Oakland firm. Attorneys throughout the Bay Area began referring clients to me when they encountered cases involving sophisticated financial manipulation or complex custody disputes where traditional legal strategies weren't sufficient. The referrals came with a consistent pattern. These were cases where the opposing party was using the legal system as a weapon, employing delay tactics, financial hiding, and psychological manipulation that went far beyond normal divorce proceedings. The clients were often women who had been systematically undermined and needed attorneys who could see through tactics that appeared legitimate on the surface but were actually calculated abuse. One case that became pivotal in establishing my professional expertise involved Dr. Samantha Chen, a pediatric surgeon whose husband had spent 5 years preparing for their divorce without her knowledge. David Chen was a financial advisor who had used his professional expertise to create an elaborate web of hidden assets, offshore accounts, and artificial debt that made their substantial wealth appear minimal on paper. What made David's strategy particularly sophisticated was that everything he had done was technically legal. He had established legitimate business entities, made real investments, and created genuine financial obligations. But the timing and structure of these transactions were designed specifically to minimize his apparent net worth during divorce proceedings. Most attorneys would have accepted David's financial statements at face value or conducted standard discovery that would have missed the deeper patterns. But my experience with Derek's manipulation, combined with what I had learned from Rebecca's case and others, had taught me to look for psychological motivations behind financial decisions. "When did your husband first mention divorce?" I asked Samantha during our initial consultation. "He never mentioned it directly," she replied. "But looking back, I think he'd been planning it for years. He became increasingly critical of my work schedule, started making comments about how my career was affecting our marriage." "Can you think of any specific financial changes that coincided with those comments?" Samantha frowned, thinking carefully. "Actually, yes. Around the time he started complaining about my work, he also began talking about needing to diversify our investments. He said my income was too unpredictable, that we needed more stable revenue streams." I made notes about the timeline, already seeing patterns that suggested deliberate preparation rather than spontaneous financial planning. Over the following weeks, I worked with a forensic accountant to trace David's financial transactions over the previous 5 years. What we discovered was a masterclass in divorce preparation. David had systematically transferred marital assets into business entities that he controlled, then used those entities to purchase investments that would be difficult to value or liquidate. He had taken on business debts that were technically legitimate but structured in ways that would reduce his apparent wealth during divorce proceedings. Most cleverly, he had created a paper trail that made Samantha appear financially irresponsible. He had documented instances when her medical practice expenses were higher than usual, characterized her professional equipment purchases as luxury spending, and presented her student loan payments as evidence that she was a financial burden on their marriage. The strategy was brilliant in its psychological sophistication. David wasn't just hiding money. He was creating a narrative that portrayed Samantha as the party who had damaged their financial stability. He was preparing to argue that she deserved minimal support because she had been a net drain on their resources. But his psychological manipulation had a weakness. It was based on the assumption that Samantha would accept his version of reality. Like most financial abusers, David had become convinced that his victim was actually as incompetent as he claimed she was. He had structured his hiding tactics to fool someone who would accept his explanations without investigation. He hadn't planned for an attorney who understood that financial abuse was fundamentally about control rather than money, who knew that abusers often revealed their tactics through their overconfidence in their own cleverness. Working on Samantha's case required me to become an expert in business valuation, offshore banking, and complex investment strategies. I spent months learning about the specific financial instruments David had used, consulting with experts who could help me understand the true value of his assets and the artificial nature of his claimed debts. But the real breakthrough came when I realized that David's elaborate financial planning had created its own evidence trail. His transactions were so carefully structured and perfectly timed that they revealed their own manipulative purpose. No one made that many strategic financial moves coincidentally. During David's deposition, I was able to walk him through his financial decisions chronologically, asking him to explain the business rationale for each transaction. Initially, he appeared confident and well prepared, offering sophisticated explanations for his investment strategies. But as the questioning continued, the pattern became undeniable. Every major financial decision David had made in the previous 5 years had the effect of reducing his apparent wealth while maintaining his actual control over assets. When pressed to explain this coincidence, his explanations became increasingly implausible. The turning point came when I asked him about a particularly complex transaction, where he had borrowed money from one of his own business entities to purchase an investment that he then claimed was worthless. "Mr. Chen," I said, "can you explain why you would borrow money from your own company to purchase an investment that you now claim has no value?" "Sometimes investments don't work out," he replied, his confidence beginning to waver. "But according to these documents, you purchased this investment just 3 months before filing for divorce. Did you really believe it was a good investment? Or were you creating artificial debt to reduce your net worth?" David's attorney objected, but the damage was done. The question revealed the core issue. David's financial decisions hadn't been made for legitimate business reasons, but as preparation for divorce proceedings. Over the following hour, I systematically walked David through similar transactions, each one revealing the same pattern of artificial complexity designed to hide wealth. By the end of the deposition, it was clear that his elaborate financial planning had been motivated by divorce preparation rather than sound investment strategy. The case settled 2 weeks later for an amount that reflected the actual value of the marital estate rather than David's carefully constructed fiction. More importantly, Samantha recovered not just financial assets, but her confidence in her own perceptions. She had known something was wrong with David's explanations, but his psychological manipulation had made her doubt her own intelligence and judgment. "How did you see through it?" she asked me after the settlement conference. "He convinced me for years that I was too naive to understand financial matters." "That's what makes these tactics so effective," I replied. "They're designed to make you question your own judgment." "But your instincts were right. You knew something didn't make sense about his explanations. But I would never have been able to prove it. That's why you hired me. I've seen these patterns before, and I know how to document them in ways that courts can understand." The success of Samantha's case established my reputation for handling complex financial manipulation cases. But it also taught me something important about my own professional development. I wasn't just learning legal techniques. I was developing an intuitive understanding of how abusive personalities operated within legal frameworks. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.